American forces fighting in a faraway land to free its people from tyranny. A president vowing to introduce democracy. A long, difficult struggle to achieve stability and prosperity. This is Iraq 2003. In 1898, it was Puerto Rico. Go back in time more than a century to the Spanish-American War. Vastly superior U.S. troops are liberating the people of Puerto Rico from their Spanish overlords. Victory is so swift that the war is over before the Americans even reach the island's capital. Now return to the present to observe the fruits of that conquest. In Puerto Rico, promises of freedom have fallen short of full democracy. Mistrust, miscommunication, and mismanagement have prevented progress. And American taxpayers have shouldered a financial burden totaling hundreds of billions of dollars. So what's being done to set things right? Half-hearted attempts by officials in Washington have led to nothing. Local politicians in San Juan have maneuvered each other into a stalemate. And the vast majority of Americans know little about Puerto Rico's plight. It's up to knowledgeable people across the United States to bring this critical issue to national attention. Our universities, always willing to advance the debate on complex and controversial matters, are recognizing that Puerto Rico is a timely topic for academic consideration. One such institution is the American University in Washington, D.C., a center for the study of national and international politics. Recently, the University School of Public Affairs tackled the issue of Puerto Rico's unresolved political status with the seminar, Puerto Rico in Search of Full Democracy.
Our role, as we see it, is not only to educate our own students, but to provide a forum for the debate of critical public issues. And this event today is a perfect example of the kind of thing that we see as central to our mission.
This extraordinary opportunity comes at a time in history when a commitment between the island's leadership and the federal government must transcend beyond previous efforts and perceptions.
Puerto Rico, an island possession of the United States and home to nearly 4 million resident American citizens, has the political status of an unincorporated territory. In short, it is an American colony. It lacks national sovereignty, and while residents of Puerto Rico fight and die in the U.S. Armed Forces, they have no proportional representation in Congress and no vote for president. In exchange for this abrogation of their civil rights, residents of Puerto Rico pay no federal income tax. Taxes play a major role in a new book that's drawing attention to the island's status dilemma, Pay to the Order of Puerto Rico, by Alexander Odeshalitze and Arthur Laffer. The book reveals the staggering costs of colonization in Puerto Rico, as co-author Odeshalitze explained at American University.
America was the last major country to give up slavery. Will it be the last to give up colonialism? Especially when it costs U.S. taxpayers $22 billion a year, of which $400 every year is my money.
Pay to the Order of Puerto Rico describes how a nobly intended ideology of industrial development turned into a long-term tax boondoggle. In the first half of the 20th century, Puerto Rico was rural, agrarian, and known as the poorhouse of the Caribbean. But major federal funding and tax breaks after World War II led to industrialization and urbanization, high employment, and a skilled, educated, high-tech workforce. However, more recently, the economy has gone nowhere as incentives for growth have turned into convenient tax shelters. Now, every year sees rising rates of crime and unemployment and a widening economic gap between Puerto Rico and the 50 states. And the main beneficiaries of this slump are U.S. pharmaceutical companies who receive billions of dollars in tax credits each year. Meanwhile, Puerto Rico remains a dependent territory where per capita income is less than half that of Mississippi, the poorest state.
I think it's time this despicable condition came to a screeching halt. Both the U.S. taxpayers And people of Puerto Rico deserve better.
So what do Puerto Ricans have to say about all this? The status debate in Puerto Rico has long been dominated by local political parties. In the absence of clear federal guidelines, they have come up with their own, often contradictory definitions of the island's choices. At the AU seminar, however, 3 status options were debated by individuals not currently holding political office.
We're protected by the U.S. Constitution, but we cannot participate in amending it. It's not ours.
Making the case for statehood was Carlos Chardon, the former Secretary of Education of Puerto Rico.
We need to start out by making it very clear that this colonial mess that we're in was created by you.
Manuel Rodriguez Orellana is a law professor, columnist, and Secretary of North American Relations for the Puerto Rico Independence Party.
The time for childlike partisan politics is over.
Luis Vega Ramos is the former president of Pro-ELA, an organization advocating for Puerto Rico in free association with the United States. All 3 speakers agreed that Puerto Rico's current territorial status must come to an end.
It is clear that the time for tutelage is over.
Colonial continuation is a denial of democracy.
We're subjects of America and citizens of America. We're separate and unequal, and truly the children of Plessy versus Ferguson.
The panelists cited the economic stagnation caused by the status quo.
In the last 30 years, dozens of countries, smaller than Puerto Rico, equally populated or more overpopulated than Puerto Rico, have developed economically better and faster than Puerto Rico in the same period of time.
And all the participants held that Congress hasn't done enough to bring about a permanent political status for the nearly 4 million U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico.
Local plebiscites, local Puerto Rican plebiscites have not been the way.
In the end, it's all for nothing. Congress has ultimate control. There's little we can do about it.
The problem has been lack of congressional will to enact a process to deal with Puerto Rico.
We are tired of being told in Puerto Rico that we have to get our act together. Oh, our act is pretty much together. We want decolonization.
I yield back the balance of my time.
Congress came close to enacting a self-determination process in 1998. Representative Don Young of Alaska introduced the bill calling for an official status referendum in Puerto Rico. The Young bill was passed in the U.S. House, but never received a vote in the Senate. More recently, Puerto Ricans are uniting across party lines to demand action from Washington. In 2005, both houses of the local legislature unanimously agreed on an historic status bill urging the President and the United States Congress to provide the island with fully democratic options for a non-colonial and non-territorial future. If Congress acts to put Puerto Rico on the path to self-determination, residents of the island will have 3 choices under U.S. and international law. Jeffrey Farrow, in an analysis of the federal government's position, clarified each status option.
Puerto Ricans should understand the alternatives to continued territory status. Statehood is defined by the Constitution of the United States and is equality within the U.S. system. With the increasing Hispanic vote, it would be political suicide for either national party to oppose statehood on the grounds that Puerto Rico is too Hispanic if the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico, who have sacrificed so much, ask for statehood. Puerto Ricans should also understand that the United States would go to great lengths to make independence economically viable if Puerto Ricans sought nationhood after a century of relations. Related to this is that Puerto Rico can also become a nation in a true free association with the United States. The U.S. has free association relationships with 3 island groups in the Pacific. A free association relationship with Puerto Rico should be at least as generous as the Pacific Island arrangements.
There was little agreement at the American University seminar over which course would be best for Puerto Rico. Carlos Chardon argued that statehood offers a path out of colonial dependence.
Commonwealth has brought about the loss of self-respect, for it can only take, not give. Statehood is a way out of a sinkhole that widens and deepens as more federal transfers come into Puerto Rico without corresponding responsibility of full federal taxation. Statehood means responsibility.
What's more, he said statehood would maintain the connection between the residents of Puerto Rico and the millions of Puerto Ricans living in the 50 states.
Over half of our population lives stateside. Of this population, part of it is much more at ease in English and Spanish. And they don't feel any less Puerto Rican than anyone in this table.
Manuel Rodriguez Orellana, on the other hand, portrayed independence as the best way to affirm and protect the unique identity of Puerto Rico's people.
It's the only, in my way of thinking, flexible, stable, and permanent solution to our becoming better friends and neighbors. Puerto Rico as a colony, or as a colony with congressional representation and with a vote for federal office, would still be a bad fit, I think, for the United States. We are in a process of constant cultural affirmation, and it would be a process of a constant threat of secession, Caribbean Quebec, if you like, and a constant source of political instability.
Luis Vega Ramos proposed that the U.S. grant more powers to the island through an expansion of the current Commonwealth arrangement.
The best way to correct the present democratic deficit, as a former governor of Puerto Rico has put it, is to empower the Commonwealth status, the current Commonwealth status, through a new compact of association that recognizes clearly and that establishes clearly Puerto Rico's non-territorial status, and that states equally in clear terms the limits of legitimate federal intervention and federal action in Puerto Rican affairs. The only way to enter into a binding bilateral compact with the federal government is to be outside the territorial clause. The U.S. has already done this on 3 occasions since 1986. This precedent needs not to be duplicated exactly for Puerto Rico. Rather, it gives us a bold parameter for the establishment of a clearly non-territorial relationship between Puerto Rico and the U.S.
No matter what direction Puerto Rico ultimately chooses, it's time for people across the United States to stand up and say, enough is enough.
The day that Puerto Rico will ever move from this colonial status to some kind of a permanent status will be when the American people get so mad at their members of Congress that they'll say, if you continue to take money from capital, we're not going to vote you into office because Puerto Rico is either costing us too much money, let's make them pay taxes, or Puerto Rico is just costing us too much money and we got to let them go.
The American University Seminar is just one example of how institutions of higher learning can help end America's failed exercise in colonialism through a frank and civil discussion of Puerto Rico's past, present, and future.
This is the kind of event that should be taken nationally and internationally to demonstrate that it's not about the political bashing. It's not about the sensation of the news in terms of plain politics, but about the true values and the representative ideologies of the different sectors in society.
Even though some of the people involved in this forum had some connection with elected politics in Puerto Rico, most of the people were academics or they were just active politically but not elected officials. So because of that, every one of them didn't necessarily have a political future to protect for themselves, but they spoke from the heart. And I think because of that, we had a successful forum.